Imani Ashby was 41 years old when her husband leaned across the mediation table during their divorce hearing and whispered that she would never touch his money again. The room smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. The kind of windowless conference room every county courthouse seemed to keep tucked behind its main hallway for exactly this purpose. Around the courthouse hallway that morning, people who didn't know better assumed she was just another spouse who'd spent 15 years running a household while her husband built a construction empire from nothing. She wore a modest gray suit she'd owned since her CPA exam. She carried a second-hand leather briefcase instead of the designer one Roland had given her for an anniversary neither of them mentioned anymore. He leaned in close enough that his own mediator never heard him, voice low and satisfied, certain that the account he'd quietly opened in Nevada 18 months earlier made him untouchable. $3. $8 million was the number Roland believed he'd successfully moved across 4 accounts scattered from Nevada to the Cayman Islands, safely out of any judge's reach. What Roland never thought to ask, not once in 15 years of marriage, was why his wife had spent the last decade building a career finding exactly this kind of money for other people's divorces. What happened over the rest of that hearing, once the mediator called the room back to order, was going to cost Roland every offshore dollar he already believed he'd won. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. 2 years before that hearing, Imani's mornings began the same way they always had. At her kitchen table by 6, a mug of black coffee going cold beside a legal pad covered in numbers only she could make sense of, tracing discrepancies in a client's spreadsheet before Roland even stirred upstairs. Her father, an ears auditor for 31 years before he passed, used to tell her, "Money doesn't lie. People do. Follow the money and you'll never have to trust a person's word again." She had built an entire career on that sentence, tracing missing marital assets for other women's divorces long before she ever thought to ask whether her own paperwork told the same kind of story. At dinner parties, Roland introduced her as the numbers person, a phrase that always got a polite laugh and never once mentioned the small forensic accounting practice she'd built from nothing. The one family court judges across 3 counties had learned to trust whenever a case needed someone to find money a spouse swore didn't exist. She kept a single-framed photograph on her desk, her father in his auditor's badge outside the federal building where he'd worked for 3 decades, and she touched the corner of the frame every morning before opening her laptop, a small ritual she had never once explained to Roland or to anyone else who might have asked why it mattered. Her own office, tucked into the back half of a converted bungalow 2 miles from home, had a waiting list longer than most divorce attorneys in the county could offer their own clients, though Roland had never once asked to see it in all the years she'd run it. She had testified in front of 3 different judges that year alone, walked juries through spreadsheets most attorneys couldn't parse on their own, and driven home each night to a husband who still asked, gently, whether her little side business was keeping her too busy. Roland still brought her coffee some mornings, still asked about her clients over dinner, still kissed her on his way out the door. He was, to nearly everyone who knew him, a devoted husband and a self-made success story. The kind of man other contractors pointed to at industry mixers as proof that hard work alone could build an empire. He had also, in the last year, started keeping a second phone in the glove compartment of his truck, a detail Imani noticed the same way she noticed a client's spreadsheet that added up to a suspiciously round number, worth a second look, not yet worth an accusation. Only 2 of Imani's closest colleagues knew that she had quietly used her own signing bonus, 12 years earlier, to cover the down payment on Ashby Construction's first piece of equipment, back when Roland's company was still just a folder of unpaid invoices and a used flatbed truck parked behind his mother's garage. Roland told that story at industry dinners as though he'd built the company entirely alone. She had never corrected him. It had never once occurred to her that not correcting him would eventually cost her anything. They had met 14 years earlier at a community college night class on small business bookkeeping, where Roland was 3 weeks behind on the homework and asked, sheepishly, if she'd walk him through a balance sheet over coffee. He had been humble then. Grateful. He used to call her his secret weapon in front of his subcontractors. And for those first few years, he clearly meant it as the highest compliment he had. He used to stay up late with her at the kitchen table, watching her fix his invoicing errors, telling her he didn't know what he'd do without someone who actually understood the numbers, kissing the top of her head before she'd even finished the last column. That version of him was the reason she had said yes to a second cup of coffee. And yes again, 18 months later, when he asked something bigger over a folding table in his half-finished office trailer. In the weeks before that Thursday, small things had started gathering at the edge of Imani's attention without quite announcing themselves. Roland had started coming home later, always with a reasonable explanation attached. A supplier meeting that ran long. A job site inspection that needed his personal attention. He'd also started leaving his laptop closed and locked in his truck instead of on the kitchen counter where it had always lived. A small change she noticed the same way she noticed a client's numbers that rounded a little too cleanly. Once, folding his laundry, she found a receipt from a jewelry store 2 towns over. Dated a night he'd told her he was working late for an item too small and too specific to be a gift for her. She said nothing, she simply filed it away. The way she filed away every irregularity before deciding whether it was worth a closer look. Then, on an unremarkable Thursday, Imani noticed a wire transfer on Ashby Construction's own books. A modest one, $9,400, routed to an equipment vendor in Nevada she'd never heard of, on a day the company hadn't purchased any equipment at all. She didn't ask Roland about it that night. She opened a spreadsheet instead. The same kind she built for clients who suspected their spouses of hiding money, and started pulling 6 months of the company's bank statements under the guise of doing the quarterly books she'd always quietly handled anyway. $9,400 became $14,000 the following month. Then $22,000 2 months after that, always routed to the same Nevada vendor. Always on days the company's actual equipment purchases showed no matching invoice anywhere in the books. She cross-checked the vendor's registered address against public business filings and found a small, unremarkable office suite that shared a street with a private mailbox service, the kind of address that existed on paper and nowhere else. Her hands didn't shake while she built the timeline. Her face remained perfectly calm at dinner that same week, the way it always did when a client's numbers finally started making an uncomfortable kind of sense. One evening, his phone lit up on the counter with a text preview from a contact saved only as D. Something about wiring the rest before the mediation started. She didn't need to ask who D was. The name Deja had come up twice already at company barbecues over the past year. Always introduced as a vendor rep. Always seated a little too close to Roland's end of the table. Always laughing at his jokes a beat too early. Cross-referencing the dates, Imani found that the earliest Nevada transfer had gone out only 3 weeks after the first barbecue where Deja appeared, and that the jewelry store receipt she'd found in his laundry lined up almost exactly with a hotel charge on a card she hadn't known existed. 18 months. That was how far back the pattern went once she finished tracing it. 18 months of steady, deliberate movement into 4 separate accounts, timed almost precisely to the length of whatever this had become. He had been building his exit for a year and a half, while she quietly kept his company's real books running underneath him the entire time. She closed the laptop, called her firm's most trusted colleague the next morning, and opened a case file the exact way she'd opened hundreds of them before for other women. Except this time, for the first time in her career, her own name was the one printed at the top. She was a forensic accountant. She had spent 15 years learning that you never confronted a client's spouse the moment you found the first irregularity. You traced it to its source, measured exactly how far it ran, and only then decided what the marriage could actually survive. 4 days later, Imani sat across her own conference table from Yolanda Briggs, a divorce attorney who had cross-referenced enough of Imani's own forensic reports over the years to trust her completely. She slid over the wire transfer timeline, the 4 account numbers, and a printed text thread pulled from a shared family cloud backup neither of them had ever thought to disable. Yolanda read for nearly 15 minutes without speaking, flipping back twice to check dates against each other the same careful way Imani herself reviewed a client's evidence, then said only, "In 11 years of practice, I have never once had a client hand me a case this clean on day 1. She explained, in the same clear language Imani used with her own clients, exactly how the law treated marital assets moved offshore during a pending divorce, exactly why the timing of those Nevada transfers, every one of them dated after Deja first appeared in company records, would matter enormously to a judge, and exactly why Imani, of all people, made an unusually difficult witness for Rollins' attorney to discredit. "Keep the books running exactly the way you always have," Yolanda told her. Let him believe the numbers were still just quietly hers to manage. Everything else was preparation. Imani's mother, Ruth, 79 and still sharp enough to catch her daughter in a half-truth over the phone, listened to the whole account from her recliner without interrupting once. Her hands folded in her lap the same steady way Imani's own hands folded when she was thinking instead of reacting. Then, she told Imani something she'd never mentioned before. Rollins' own father had done something almost identical to his first wife decades earlier, quietly moving equipment and cash out of a small landscaping business right before that divorce was finalized. A story Ruth had heard secondhand at a funeral years ago and simply filed away without ever repeating it. "I always wondered if it would skip him or land on him," Ruth admitted. "Some things skip a generation and land right back where they started," she said, setting her tea down with a small, deliberate click. "You caught his before it finished landing. Not every wife gets that chance." A colleague of Yolanda's ran a quiet background check on Deja Monroe and returned a file that read like something out of Imani's own casework. $34,000 in personal tax liens filed against her over the past 3 years, a car repossession 8 months earlier, and a recovered text in which Deja told Rollins plainly that she needed her half moved somewhere safe before anyone's lawyers got involved. A separate filing showed Deja had opened her own small LLC 11 months earlier, registered to the same private mailbox address as the Nevada equipment vendor. A detail that took Imani less than a minute to recognize once she saw it printed on the page. None of it proved Deja had understood exactly how illegal the transfers were. All of it proved she had understood enough to help build the account that would eventually hold them. Imani brought the whole timeline, stripped of any names, to a senior colleague at her own firm the following week, the way she always did when she needed a second set of eyes before finalizing a report for court. He read through it twice, the same careful way he reviewed every case she'd ever handed him, then looked up and asked, almost gently, whose marriage this actually was. She told him. He didn't say much after that, only that in 18 years of practice he'd rarely seen a paper trail this complete, and that whoever's husband this was had made the mistake every careless client eventually made, assuming that because his wife never mentioned the numbers out loud, she wasn't reading them at all. He offered, quietly, to testify as a corroborating witness if it ever came to that. She thanked him and told him she hoped it wouldn't need to. At home, Imani kept doing Ashby Construction's books exactly the way she always had. Kept flagging the same routine expenses, kept saying nothing about the account she now knew by heart. One evening, refilling his glass, Rollins mentioned, almost too casually, that he was thinking about restructuring some of the business accounts before tax season. "Makes sense," Imani said, not looking up from her spreadsheet. "You want me to take a look at anything before you file?" He told her no. He had it handled this time. "I trust you," she said, and meant it in a way he had no reason to question, and went back to her numbers. A few weeks later, he tried again, almost testing the waters, mentioning that his accountant had suggested moving some equipment funds to simplify things before the new fiscal year. "Sounds efficient," Imani said, refilling his glass instead of her own. He smiled at that, relieved, the same way he always smiled when he believed a conversation had gone exactly the way he wanted it to. Some things you don't say out loud, even to the person you're already building a case against. She said almost nothing that entire season. She only watched and waited and let the file grow one statement at a time. Then, 3 weeks before the divorce was formally filed, a fifth account appeared on a statement Imani wasn't supposed to still have access to. A joint business card Roland had forgotten she still monitored, showing a transfer large enough that Yolanda called her within the hour. Whatever timeline Roland believed he was working with, she said, he'd clearly decided to accelerate it. 2 days later, Roland told Imani, gently, that he thought it might be time to talk to lawyers, just to be safe. She told him that sounded like the responsible thing to do, and meant it more than he understood. He filed the paperwork himself 3 weeks later, still convinced the 4 accounts he'd already moved were safely out of anyone's reach. The mediator cleared his throat and called the room back to order, unaware of what Roland had just whispered. Glancing up briefly at the sound of Imani settling back into her chair, with the same steady composure she brought to every deposition that wasn't her own. Roland reached for his water glass, satisfied, the way a man reaches for something after he believes he's already won. Yolanda Briggs asked, evenly, whether opposing counsel's client would like to explain a series of transfers routed through 4 accounts in Nevada and the Cayman Islands over the preceding 18 months. Roland's easy composure did not so much as flicker for the first 10 seconds, right up until Yolanda slid the first printed statement across the table. She laid the documents out one at a time, unhurried, naming each as she went. The $9,400 transfer with no matching equipment invoice, the escalating pattern that climbed past $22,000 within 2 months, the 5th account discovered on a card Roland had forgotten his wife still monitored. Deja's own LLC registered to that same private mailbox address. The jewelry store receipt that lined up with a hotel charge on a card Imani hadn't known existed. And a text from a contact saved only as D asking him to move the rest before mediation started. Roland's attorney, flipping through his own copy for the first time, went very quiet. Roland's face moved from certainty to disbelief to something closer to panic as each page landed in front of him, because there was nothing left in that room still confused enough to argue with. Yolanda reminded the room, plainly, exactly who Imani Ashby was. A forensic accountant with 15 years of experience finding precisely this kind of money for other people's divorces. The same woman whose signing bonus had covered the down payment on the company's very first piece of equipment 12 years earlier, back when there was no company to speak of yet, only a folder of unpaid invoices and a used flatbed truck. She reminded the room, too, that Imani had testified as an expert witness in dozens of cases nearly identical to this one. Cases where a spouse believed a few offshore accounts and a private mailbox address would be enough to outrun a forensic trail. Every dollar Roland believed he'd hidden, Imani had already traced, dated, and matched against a mistress's own outstanding debts months before he ever sat down at that table, certain he'd won. Roland tried anyway. He said the accounts were for a legitimate business expansion, that Deja was simply a vendor contact and nothing more, that any transfers were just timing coincidences his attorney could easily explain away. He said, quietly, that he'd only been trying to protect the business from a messy divorce, as though protecting it from her had ever been the same thing as protecting it at all. His own attorney, still holding the printed statements, said quietly that he would need a recess before making any further representations to the court. The mediator, reviewing the timeline himself, noted for the record that a pattern of transfers beginning shortly after the mistress's documented appearance in company records would be relevant to any equitable distribution determination going forward. Roland looked at Imani the way a man looks at a ledger he assumed had been closed years ago, only to discover it had been open and balanced the entire time. Imani gathered her folder, the same kind of folder she had built for 100 other women before she ever needed one of her own, and said only, "You told me I'd never touch your money again. I already had. I just never needed to tell you when." She did not raise her voice. She did not look at Deja's name on the page again once the hearing recessed. She gathered her second-hand briefcase, stood, and walked out of the room ahead of her own attorney, past the same windowless hallway that had smelled like burnt coffee 2 hours earlier, leaving Roland at the table with a stack of paperwork that mapped, in exact and legible detail, the precise shape of his own undoing. 14 months later, Imani sat at a new kitchen table in a smaller, sunnier house she'd bought outright with her share of the settlement. A legal pad in front of her covered in numbers that belonged, for once, entirely to a stranger's marriage instead of her own. Bledsoe Forensic Accounting, the practice she'd finally put her maiden name back on after 15 years of using his, had just been retained by the State Bar Association to train new family law attorneys on tracing offshore transfers. The exact skill that had once been dismissed at dinner parties as the numbers thing she does on the side. She had also, quietly, been named an expert witness of record in 2 other counties, a title nobody at those old company barbecues would have thought to attach to her name. Her waiting list, once a source of gentle household teasing, now stretched 4 months out, and she had hired her first associate that spring, a young CPA she was training to read a spreadsheet the exact way her father once taught her. Elijah, a quiet tax attorney she'd met through a mutual referral 6 months after the divorce finalized, had a habit of asking about her actual caseload instead of politely changing the subject the way Roland always had. And he had become, without any particular announcement, a permanent and welcome part of her mornings. He had never once suggested she simplify her explanations for his benefit. And he read every report she showed him twice, the same way she had always read his. He liked to sit across from her at that new kitchen table some evenings, each of them working through their own stack of client files in comfortable silence, and she had come to understand that the silence itself was its own kind of answer. Roland, she heard through mutual contacts still working in the construction industry, lost majority control of Ashby Construction after the equitable distribution ruling awarded Imani a stake, reflecting her original investment in the company's earliest days. He was still working there, she heard, but answering to a board now instead of running the place the way he once had. The state contractors licensing board opened its own inquiry once the offshore transfers became part of the public court record, and 2 of his longtime subcontractors quietly moved their business elsewhere within the year. Deja's own LLC was dissolved within months of the hearing, and the tax liens that had been quietly accumulating against her for years finally caught up once her name appeared in the court filings for anyone to search. Deja, whose financial troubles had only deepened once the affair became public knowledge among people who mattered to her, moved out of state before the ink on the settlement had even fully dried. Roland's own mother, who had once sent Imani a birthday card every single year without fail, still did, a detail Imani noted, filed, and appreciated more than she let herself examine too closely. She closed her legal pad that morning, poured a second cup of coffee, and thought, not for the first time, that her father had been right about nearly everything that mattered. Money didn't lie. people did. She had spent her whole career proving that sentence true for other people, one case file at a time. She had finally, quietly, proven it true for herself. Out on her small back patio, Elijah was already reviewing his own files, glancing up now and then just to watch her work, never once asking her to explain what she was writing down. Somewhere behind her, on the kitchen wall, hung the same framed photograph of her father in his auditor's badge, moved from her office desk to her own home for the first time in her adult life. She was solvent. She was clear. She was, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and permanently unbothered by any of it, in a house that belonged, on paper and in every other sense that mattered, entirely to her. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.